Today, we're going to discuss different models of obesity, the carbohydrate insulin model and the energy balance model. And of course, your recent paper, the energy balance model of obesity beyond calories in and calories out, which had a few main objectives, which was effectively to provide that current best representation of the energy balance model, because there's a lot of noise, let's call it, in terms of opinions on it, to distinguish it from a lot of those myths, and of course, to contrast it with that carbohydrate insulin model. So maybe the best place to tee this up is to start with just defining the energy balance model for us.
Yeah, so the purpose of the energy balance model, or any model of obesity or whatever the system of interest might be, is to create a framework in which you can test specific hypotheses and kind of erase some arrows, draw some arrows in, make connections stronger, whatever the evidence is allowing you to kind of evolve along the way to tell the overall picture of what system is at play here. And for obesity, the energy balance model that was put forth in this latest, or I guess reiterated in this latest review, led by Dr. Kevin Hall and many colleagues, was really outlining the EBM, or energy balance model of obesity. At its core, sounds like calories in, calories out, because you're balancing energy in, energy out, but really it's so much more than that title kind of alludes. And how calories are perceived in the environment, how they're metabolized and then expended, and why calories are stored as fat, potentially in excess, are really what this model is trying to illustrate, both based on the evidence that we do have, the evidence against it, and then what kind of questions are still remaining and needs to be established or fleshed out further, which of course there's more questions than answers. That's why this is a model, not a textbook. And there are ways to kind of challenge the pathways that the model posits and further kind of refine the evidence that we have. And that's, I guess, what scientists do. And that's where the model that we describe in the paper is where a lot of the evidence is basically pointing to today.
Yeah, it's interesting how, this energy balance model proposes that the brain is the primary organ responsible for body weight regulation, but that's really not the messaging we even hear amongst lay people when they talk about this model. And in the recent paper by David Ludwig and colleagues, they describe the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity as a better reflecting the knowledge on the biology of weight control as compared with the energy balance model. Now, which they say, fails to consider some of these key biological mechanisms that promote weight gain. So can we sidestep here and just talk about what is that carbohydrate insulin model? And perhaps you can highlight some of the main arguments that they have against this energy balance model.
Yeah, so the energy balance model, which you described, is related to more of the function in the brain than more peripherally throughout the body. It's basically saying that the environment is likely a major driver of the current obesity epidemic, which is what this model is attempting to describe. And what interacts most with the environment is probably our subconscious perception of cues and foods and inputs all around us. That's probably playing a big role. And then when we look between individuals, so we're all essentially to some extent exposed to this new environment that's different from our food environment back in the 60s. Why is there still heterogeneity and differences between individuals with obesity or overweight, or just like basically what you might think of as susceptibility to this food environment? So there's clearly a non-environmental or genetic role that might be interacting with the environment around us. And so the EBM has the brain at the forefront, kind of processing cues from throughout the body that interact with the environment and the external cues. Whereas the CIM, or this carbohydrate insulin model of obesity, rather than the arrows of the environment going into the human physiology, it's the human physiology seeking out more calories. And so this swapping of the arrows where obesity begets obesity. And the biology that's proposed underlying this is proposes that, as we consume high carbohydrate or high glycemic index diets, those are the diets that raised your blood glucose levels more so than other foods postprandially. this subsequent rise and then fall in insulin levels that physiologically respond to your glucose cause your adipose cells and other peripheral tissues to take up more fuels than it probably should. So what's left in circulation is perceived throughout your body as not enough because too much was stored, right? So there's this excessive partitioning of fuels from circulation into some tissues more than, I guess, what you might consider their fair share. So then, you're left a little bit hungrier than you should, and you seek out kind of a corrective amount of calories to make up for the perceived lack of fuel in circulation. So that's, this arrow of kind of obesity is causing overeating rather than overeating causing obesity is the main distinguished aspect between the EBM and the CIM. And, as you can imagine, there's a lot of overlap between these models as well, but that's probably the most striking difference in the branding.
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating how in your paper, you describe how any valid model should withstand tests of various predictions and, either be adjusted to suit those or abandoned altogether. And most importantly, the models of obesity must explain, just as you described, that between person variability and also this recent global shift in terms of total distribution. So, the paper you outline from rodent studies, epidemiology all the way through, maybe if we could start with perhaps epidemiology, what could you give us sort of a lay of the lands of what's actually in the research at the moment? Because obviously a whole host of other factors here. When we look at adherence, types of fat in the diet, the consumption of sugar or trends in that consumption. Could you highlight and expand on that?
Sure. So as an epidemiologist, the really spirit behind what we're doing is identifying a distribution of your exposure that explains differences in your outcome. So if we have an outcome or trait like obesity, we can look at populations that have different rates of obesity and try to identify what exposures might explain that variability. You can also look within the same population over time. So the obesity epidemic in the US has served as a really interesting sort of like playground for hypotheses because we have, over the course of just a few decades, obesity skyrocketing in prevalence. And so you can take essentially the same country with presumably many of the same genetics, of course. We didn't evolve our genes in a matter of, one or two generations. And, culturally, maybe it's been relatively stable as well in the grand scheme of things. So you can look to see over time what has changed in the same population, just like you can look kind of between populations or countries. And if we do that in the US, just looking at averages, of course, there have been shifts in our food environment. And we all can anecdotally describe what a meal looked like in the 1960s versus today. But the macronutrient distributions haven't been quite as dramatic as the overall trends in manufacturing and many of the other sort of like drivers that the EBM posits might be relevant for the obesity epidemic. So carbohydrates and fat, for example, fat intake did go down after the 1980s. And this is brought on in part by the dietary guidelines recommending a lower fat diet. So there was a little bit of a demand, but then also the supply met that demand and probably exceeded it by kind of pumping out all these low fat products that were very high in carbohydrates, mostly refined carbs and sodium and a bunch of other stuff. And so there was this shift towards refined carbohydrates. And, that very well could explain part of the obesity epidemic and likely does, but doesn't tell you anything about the biology, right? So that's what the models are trying to figure out. But we also see a lot of other shifts as well, and some consistent with the obesity epidemic trends and others not so much. And we're not looking at an outcome like colorectal cancer, breast cancer, heart disease, where there's an expected lag between your exposure, your diet, and your outcome many years or decades later, right? So something like obesity should track fairly consistently with whatever the exposure of interest might be. So there aren't too many striking exposures related to carbohydrate quality or quantity that mirror those trends. But again, this is just like the population level, right? So there's so many issues with extrapolating that to any sort of causation. And we know this as epidemiologists.